Are vegan kids shorter than omnivores? A new study made a big splash last week. It looked at a group of children in Poland eating vegetarian, vegan, or omnivore diets, and it reported that, in average, the vegan kids were shorter than the omnivores. So let's take a look at the results and their significance. The kids were 5 to 10 years old, and they measured several parameters. The main differences for the vegans were: they had less fat mass, but similar lean mass. They had lower bone mineral content. They had lower cholesterol levels and inflammatory markers. The ones who did not supplement had lower vitamin D and B12 levels in their blood, while the ones who did supplement did not. And finally, what the headlines mainly focused on, vegan kids were an average of 3 centimeters shorter than omnivores. So the first thing to look at is the type of study. It's an observational study, so the investigators don't decide the diets. They find kids who are already on those diets and they just look for statistical associations. If you saw last week's video on diet and COVID, it's the same type of study and the same general issues. Now, the fact that it's observational doesn't mean it's useless. It actually makes perfect sense in this case. We can't realistically take hundreds of kids and randomize them at birth to different diets and keep them on those diets for years and years just so we can write a paper. Who would sign up for that? Right, so all the pregnant ladies on the left, your kids are gonna be vegan. Pregnant ladies on the right, your kids are gonna be paleo. Got it? Good? Good luck. What's that? You have a question? What is it? Oh, how did we decide? Well, see, you were randomized. It's a very complicated procedure. You probably wouldn't understand. We pulled your names out of a hat. Why? Because otherwise, when the study gets published, nobody takes it seriously on social media. Duh. What's that? How long? Yeah, minimum of 10 years, but if you can push it to 18, that'd be awesome. So, weekends, birthday parties, you're on that kid 24/7. Cool? Anybody else have any other questions? Yes, Margaret, what do you want? Oh, you're gonna have twins. Okay. All right, the first one that pops out is vegan, the second one is paleo. Done. What's that? Compensation? No. You don't get paid. This is for science. You just get to feel the reward of having contributed to scientific where's everybody going? Come on, wait up, guys. Oh, man. I guess it's back to the mice. So realistically, this is the type of data we'll get. And within observational studies, there are different kinds. There are prospective studies where we follow the volunteers over time and we see the differences develop, and that's actually more convincing. And then there are cross-sectional studies, like this one, where we just look at a snapshot, one point in time. And that's more prone to confounders because we don't know what differences were already there to begin with. So we bear in mind the caveats of the experimental design. We don't dismiss the study reflexively. We still go through it carefully. We still take it on board. For the height difference, which is what most people focused on, the first issue is that they did some unusual things with their statistics. Okay, we're gonna get uber nerdy here for a second, but bear with me, it's not gonna be too long. When we have two different populations, in this case, vegans and omnivores, and we're comparing one parameter across them, like for example, cholesterol levels, there's a certain risk of a false positive. False positive meaning we make an observation by chance that doesn't really reflect the different treatments, in this case, the different diets. And that risk is accounted for in the statistical tests. But when we make multiple comparisons, like we're comparing their height and their weight and their B12 and their cholesterol, now the risk of a false positive goes up. So to minimize that risk, there are some statistical corrections that are done. And this is pretty standard. It's done all the time, but they didn't do it. And we'll see in a minute why. So Dr. Avi Bitterman has pointed this out, and he went and did those statistical corrections himself. And when you do them, the height and the bone differences in the vegans all go away. They're not statistically significant. Check out Avi's channel for more details, and he's a wealth of knowledge in general. So when we cross the T's and dot the I's, there was no significant difference in height in the vegans, unlike the lower cholesterol in the vegans, which did hold even after all the statistical corrections. So in a way, that was the most statistically robust finding of the study, that the vegan kids had better cardiovascular profiles. But let's look past all of these statistical issues. Let's say the difference is real, and these vegan kids were shorter. The author's justification for not doing the statistical corrections was that they wanted to set the bar lower on purpose to make sure they picked up any possible differences, even if that meant raising the risk of picking up a false positive. Let's accept that at face value. And let's say for the sake of the argument that the difference in height is real, that population of vegan kids in Poland was indeed shorter than the omnivores. What causes that difference? Is it the vegan diet itself, the lack of animal products, or is it something else? Right off the bat, we have some red flags. Less than half of vegan kids were taking B12 supplements. Some were eating fortified foods, which may or may not get you enough, depending how you do it, but almost a third of children weren't getting either. No supplements, no fortified foods, no source of B12, which is shocking. It's dangerous for adults to be without B12, but for growing children, it's just stunning. Also, only a third of vegans are supplementing vitamin D. And not surprisingly, in those 33%, vitamin D levels were the same as omnivores, but the 67% that were not supplementing had lower vitamin D. And the iron status of the vegans was also lower. So the question is, are the kids shorter, assuming they are indeed shorter, because they're not getting enough of some essential nutrients? And is this necessary in vegan diets? In other words, if a vegan diet is planned properly, with adequate nutrient intakes, with B12, etc., do we still see a height difference? By the way, this cuts both ways. The better cardiovascular profile of the vegan kids doesn't prove that omnivore diets are bad for the heart. We have to investigate if that's something inherent to omnivore diets, or if there was something specific that wasn't being done very well that we can improve on. So we have to use the same logic across, and we'll circle back to this in the end. Okay, so if a vegan diet is planned appropriately, do we still see a height difference? If we don't, then that means the key is to plan it right. Great. But if we still see it, even with B12, etc., then maybe there is something inherent to vegan diets that inhibits growth. I went over every study I could find on this topic of children growing on vegan diets, all the way back to the 80s, to try and get a sense of totality of evidence. There are 4 recent studies, including the Polish one we just looked at, and then there are a couple older studies, mainly in the 80s. So not a lot. So we'll go over briefly everything that's out there so you can have that information and you can make your own informed decision. Another study also published this year comes from Finland. They went to daycare centers and recruited kids 1 to 7 years old. Well, they talked to the parents, I'm sure. I hope. Some kids were vegans, some were vegetarians, and some were omnivores, just like the Polish study. B12 intake was similar in all groups, and all but one vegan kid was taking B12 supplements, so that's good. But more important than who's supplementing and who's fortifying are the actual B12 levels in the body, and they were adequate in all 3 groups. And there were no differences in iron status either. Iron status did not differ between vegans and omnivores. So next they measured height. That's what we want to know. The gray area is the 2 standard deviation range, which includes most of the population. All vegans fell in that range, and most vegetarians and most omnivores, with 1 or 2 outliers that fall below 2 standard deviations and could be classified as stunted. The clearest outlier actually being an omnivore. But of course, these are exceptions. We're talking about 4 to 10% of the population who are outliers. So we'd have to investigate those individual cases to find out why they're outside the norm. Doesn't necessarily say anything about the diet in general. In fact, there were no significant differences in average height between the 3 diets. So, bottom line, this study suggests normal height of vegan kids in this population with appropriate B12. Now, I take this study with a grain of salt because the sample size, the number of children, was pretty small, and also the vegan kids had borderline vitamin D status. So we take it in for what it's worth, and let's see what else is published. Next, we have 2 studies from Germany. This video is like the Euro Championship. Every study is from a different European country. We just lost every US viewer with that reference. They're like, Euro Championship? What's he talking about? It's a soccer competition. Never mind. The first study from Germany looked at 1 to 3-year-olds, but unfortunately it did not report nutrient intakes or the blood level of nutrients. I dug around and I found a meeting abstract where it says that a large percentage of the vegan kids were supplementing B12, although 10% were not taking enough of it and were below required intakes. So, sounds like 90% of the vegan kids were getting enough B12 and 10% were possible outliers. No word on vitamin D or any other nutrient. And this information didn't make it to the final paper. No idea why. And in this study, average height was not different between vegans and omnivores. 3.6% of vegan kids were outliers, below 2 standard deviations for height, so they met the definition of stunting. Similar to what we saw with the Finnish study, we would want to investigate to see why these outliers are outside the norm. Are these the ones that weren't getting enough B12, that 10% fraction? They don't say. They do explain that some of those shorter kids were getting very low total calories, but no further detail on nutrient intake. They conclude that vegetarian and vegan diets can ensure normal growth, although we should emphasize adequate energy and nutrient intake. The other study from Germany included a very large sample size, over 100 kids per diet, so that's good. Their age range was older, 6 to 18 years old, so something to bear in mind. 88% of vegans supplemented B12, not perfect, but much better than the Polish study. And 54% supplemented vitamin D. The authors say it themselves. The prevalence of supplementation of B12 was considerably higher than a recently published study with Polish children. But more important than the reported intakes are the actual nutrient levels in the body. We can't get around that. So they measured holotranscobalamin, which is just a fancy name for active B12 in the blood. And there was no difference between vegans and omnivores. And they also measured MMA, which is not two people fighting for a belt. It actually stands for methylmalonic acid. And it's an even more sensitive marker of B12 status, even more than B12 itself. The reason for that is that when we're B12 deficient, the levels in the serum in the blood can still be normal, but the levels in the tissues where it really counts can already be low. So MMA can detect a deficiency even before serum B12 levels start to go down. Check out our video on B12 for all the details. And there was no significant difference in MMA levels between vegans and omnivores. So, bottom line, it looks like in this study, most vegans at least were getting their B12. They estimated that 8% of vegans and 4% of omnivores may be B12 deficient. So, still some room for improvement, but large majority of children were getting their B12. Similar picture for vitamin D. No difference between diets. And iron status was also adequate on all diets. No elevated risk for iron deficiency in the vegetarian or vegan subgroup. So, nutrient levels in the body seem generally okay. No huge difference between diets. What about height? There was no significant difference in height between the three groups. Now, interestingly, this study was published this year, not far apart from the Polish one, and it actually had a larger sample size, and yet it didn't make the headlines. Interesting, right? Study finds no difference between diets is not exactly viral material. It's just important to realize that news pieces don't necessarily reflect everything that's known in the science. They filter for a very specific purpose, and that's shock value. Okay, so that's the 4 recent studies. Let's take a look at the older ones from the 80s. And they're harder to make sense of because some look at vegan children with intake of energy, calcium, and vitamin D below recommended amounts. Also, most of those older studies lack a matched control group, unlike the newer studies we just looked at. So what they did back then was they just used a reference standard, a typical growth curve. And vegan kids tended to be of normal height, although their average height was a bit below the average for the standard reference. Those studies all raise the question, is the standard reference a reliable and meaningful comparison? They discuss some caveats. For example, the reference standard populations were largely bottle-fed with early supplementation, whereas the vegan kids were largely breastfed exclusively for a longer time. But there was no reference for breastfed children specifically available at the time. So these studies raise the concern that these standards from a population predominantly bottle-fed may not reflect breastfed infants, because there could be an effect of those feeding differences on growth rate, especially at an early age. And in fact, some of these older studies see the differences only in the toddler years, but by around 5 years old, they've caught up and are not significantly shorter. So that's consistent with the differences resulting from the way they're being fed around the time of weaning, not an absolute limitation of the diets, since later on, they not only maintain growth rates, but they actually catch up. If it was an absolute limitation of the diet, you wouldn't expect them to be able to do that. So those older studies were an okay first pass. They were the first studies on this question done 40 years ago, but there is significant uncertainty around the controls they used, as well as some inadequate nutrient intake. And those older studies generally conclude that provided sufficient care is taken, a vegan diet can support normal growth and development. So, as long as it's properly planned. And they also add, vegan parents need a good knowledge of nutrition to ensure their children are properly nourished. I would argue that all parents could benefit by knowing a bit more about the basics of nutrition, but yes, it's true. Some concepts are more key for vegan families to be aware of. So more information, more education is always the answer. And we'll actually provide some of those key actionable tips at the end of this video for every dietary choice. No matter your dietary preference, we got you covered. So, looking at all the studies collectively, a couple patterns emerge. First, vast majority of kids on vegan or vegetarian diets appear to be of normal height. 2, some studies suggest normal height, but slightly lower than average, although those studies tend to have methodological issues that complicate their interpretation. For example, the Polish study, where the difference wasn't significant when we do all of the statistics, plus a good percentage of the kids weren't getting enough B12 or vitamin D. And those older studies from the 80s, which also have some nutrient adequacy issues, and most of them lack a matched control group. On the other hand, most recent studies with properly planned diets where the kids are getting their essential nutrients show no significant difference in height between vegans, vegetarians, and omnivores. So, the totality of the evidence suggests that all 3 diets can be adequate for growth, provided that things are planned correctly. All that said, 2 notes of caution. First, there isn't that much data on this, especially on properly planned vegan diets. Half a dozen to a dozen studies over 40 years is not a lot. These diets used to be a lot more uncommon, a lot more niche a generation ago, and they've recently exploded in popularity, so naturally there's a lot more interest from scientists in studying them now. So we're seeing a lot of new studies come out, a lot this year, and good news, they're getting a lot higher quality too, with careful characterization of nutrient intake and nutrient status, nutrient levels in the body. So I'm sure we'll see more and more of these come out soon. At present, I would say the data is suggestive, but there's still a degree of uncertainty. Second note of caution, when we say that the diet is appropriate if properly planned, I think that's accurate, but it's good to bear in mind that in practice, some people always seem to make mistakes one way or another when we look at large populations. So this is an individual decision. If you're going to do it, make sure you're going to familiarize yourself with the basics and do it right. For people who might have a sloppier nature, not going to supplement, not going to track anything, just going to kind of shoot from the hip, I would carefully reconsider it. I'm always going to give you the straight facts. So those are the facts on the ground to help you and your family make an informed decision. As you may have heard, the position of the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is that appropriately planned vegetarian and vegan diets are healthful and appropriate for all life stages, including pregnancy, childhood, etc. But our goal here is always to try to get a complete view of an issue. And I know we have viewers from every continent, so I went over the official position for a number of countries. In the UK, the British Dietetics Association also holds that well-planned vegan diets are appropriate at all ages. While in Germany, the German Nutrition Society has a different opinion, and I quote,
Ergänzung der Position der Deutschen Gesellschaft für Ernährung und zur Vidür.
Just kidding, they have an English version. Thank God. They find that there is still insufficient evidence. So they don't recommend vegan diets in what they call populations with special nutritional requirements, like pregnant women and children. Now, their position statement is from 2016, 5 years ago, and this update we just looked at is from 2020, last year. But after that, several studies have come out, which we looked at in this video. And interestingly, if you remember, one of the strongest ones was actually carried out in Germany. So they may have another update coming this year, next year, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what they say. So that's Germany. France is similar. A vegan diet is not recommended for infants, children, and adolescents due to the risk of nutritional deficiencies that are inevitable in the absence of supplements. So that's an accurate statement on the face of it. Without some form of supplementation, it's not sustainable. And that seems to be the root of the disagreement. The French and the Germans lean towards not safe or not enough evidence yet. And the Americans and the British lean towards it's fine as long as it's properly supplemented. I know we have viewers from many other countries, so let me know in the comments what the official position is where you live. The German document also offered an explanation for this difference of opinion across countries. Fortification is more widespread in some countries than others, which may make some organizations more comfortable. So that gives you an idea of the expert opinions. Some organizations are satisfied that it's safe, provided it's done well, and others are more conservative and want to see more data.
This is not a safe diet. We must not do it.
This is not a safe diet for our children. It is not safe without supplements. We cannot do it. No.
German viewers, French viewers, just kidding, love you.
Dude, it's totally safe, man. Just chill and do it, man.
All right, we made fun of everybody. We can move on. Much better than just knowing what the experts are saying is to also get a chance to look at the actual evidence ourselves. So there we go. All the studies featured are linked below if you want to consult them. Okay, we're going to look at some actionable tips next, but hopefully this helps you understand the process and the scientific thinking. That's always the idea with these videos. Not telling people what to eat or having diet wars, my diet is better than your diet. These are distractions. What is valuable, in my opinion, is understanding how evidence accumulates in one direction or another, how contradictory evidence is evaluated, and how we make sense of the totality of the evidence without dismissing entire fields or pretending they don't exist, and how scientific thinking, how scientific opinions evolve over time as evidence accumulates. Okay, let's wrap up with some actionable tips for each dietary choice. What can we learn from all these studies to avoid common pitfalls? First, let's look at raising kids as omnivores, by far the most common choice in Western society. What are the main red flags of an omnivore diet for kids? In the Polish study, almost a third of omnivore kids had high or borderline high LDL cholesterol, 30% in total, compared to only 1.3% of vegans. I honestly don't know what's more shocking, vegan kids without a B12 source or hypercholesterolemic 5-year-olds, which just goes to show there's a way to mess up any diet. Now, I went over the numbers, I did the math, and the omnivore kids in the Polish study were getting an average of 14% of their calories from saturated fat. The threshold where the risk for cardiovascular disease shoots up is around 10%, give or take. Vegans were at 6% and vegetarians right at 10%. Whether you're doing omnivore or vegan or vegetarian, it's doable to have the saturated fat under control, ideally under 10% of calories. That means having sources of unsaturated fat like fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and some vegetable oil if you want, and going easy on the fatty meats and the butter and the ultra-processed foods, which can also contain more saturated fat. This is doable on all 3 diets, guys. There's no reason kids need to be hypercholesterolemic at the age of 5. Along the same lines, some studies show higher fat mass on the omnivore diets, and again, that's not a necessity. It's mostly about energy density. So favoring unprocessed foods and going easy on ultra-processed foods that are more calorically dense. The last point for omnivores is folate. In these studies, usually omnivores have the lowest folate levels. Folate, or vitamin B9, is important for red blood cells and nervous system development. And foods rich in folate include leafy greens, liver, and legumes, like beans and chickpeas. Next, let's look at raising vegetarian kids. In this video, we mainly went over vegan studies because that's where the controversy tends to focus. There's a lot more studies on vegetarian kids and height, and most of them find similar height between vegetarians and omnivores. Even the Polish study found no significant difference between the vegetarians and the omnivores, so it's usually less of a controversy. That said, there are some specific pitfalls to avoid to make sure everything goes well. For example, in the Polish study, vegetarians also had lower vitamin D and B12 than omnivores. Now, this is kind of interesting. In our minds, B12 is a vegan thing, and we tend to think vegetarians are covered because they eat some animal products. But ironically, dairy and eggs are very poor B12 sources. So it's a good idea to take a B12 supplement, or when in doubt, measuring B12 levels is pretty straightforward, or the MMA test, even more sensitive. Okay, vitamin D. It's often added to milk, although not in Poland, which may explain why the vegetarian kids also had lower vitamin D unless they supplemented. So the bottom line is to be aware of whether you're getting enough from your foods, whether it's animal foods or fortified foods. In theory, you can also get vitamin D from sunlight if you live in a sunny place and if you're exposed to it enough. In practice, a lot of people are not. If in doubt, just take a vitamin D supplement, and getting it measured is pretty straightforward, simple blood test. Okay, iron. Iron can be a concern for vegetarians because milk and eggs are not good iron sources. Good vegetarian iron sources include seeds like chia seeds and sesame seeds, whole grains, legumes, and leafy greens. The trick is that the iron in plants is non-heme, so to increase absorption, you want to have it with some vitamin C, like some broccoli or bell peppers or a spritz of lemon. And avoid having tea and coffee at meals because they inhibit the absorption of non-heme iron. Although I guess most 5-year-olds aren't having cups of coffee at meals or any other time, but you never know. Other options for vegetarian iron include fortified cereals and cooking in iron kitchenware. And finally, if you need, you can supplement iron as well. Last point for vegetarians. In the Polish study, the vegetarian kids didn't have the best cardiovascular profile. They had higher glucose, VLDL cholesterol, and triglycerides than omnivores. The authors suggest the vegetarians in the study were eating more processed foods, so kind of a junky vegetarian diet, which may explain their cardiovascular profile. The authors sum it up pretty well. Just eating plant-based diets is no guarantee of health. we still need to select healthy foods. And we need to provide more advice to the public on how to eat healthily on plant-based diets. They got some good quotes, these authors. So on that note, let's look at vegan diets for kids. How to reap the benefits without the hazards. First and foremost, B12. If you're vegan, if your kid's vegan, for the love of God, take a B12 supplement. 2,000 micrograms once a week covers adult needs and more than covers it for children. Or if you prefer to do it daily, 5 micrograms for toddlers, 25 for older kids, and for teens, it's the same as adults. 50 a day or 2,000 micrograms once a week. You set a little reminder on your phone, the whole family takes it on the same day, boom, done. Yes, you can get B12 from fortified foods as well, like cereal and plant milks. But if you're going to do it that way, if you're not going to take supplements, make sure you know what you're doing. Calculate it properly. You normally need to eat those at least twice a day because we absorb a small percentage of the B12 we eat. And if in doubt, just take the pill supplement. It's simple, it's cheap, it's harder to mess up. We covered iron before, we covered D3, which is important for bone health. The other big one for bone health is calcium. Good sources of plant calcium include leafy greens low in oxalates, like kale and collard greens, tofu, and plant milks. Okay, quick word on energy intake. Sometimes people go vegan and they rely too much on just the fruits and vegetables. The risk is that it may be too calorie dilute if it's the bulk of the diet. It's good for adults to lose weight, but growing children need energy. So make sure to mix things up. Fruits and vegetables are great, but make sure to also have some beans, some lentils, soy, nuts, nut butters. Mixing those in increases caloric density as well as protein content. Another good choice are orange vegetables like sweet potato and squash, which are a bit more caloric than your non-starchy vegetables, and they're also a good source of carotenoids, which get converted to vitamin A in your body, and that's another important box to check. Now, those are fat soluble, so you want to have them with some source of fat to increase absorption, so have them with some nuts or some olive oil or whatever you like. And finally, long-chain omega-3s, DHA and EPA. It's still not known with certainty if we need to eat pre-formed long-chain omega-3s, but dietary sources, besides fish of course, include algae and algae supplements. So let us know below, what is your family's choice? What diet are your kids on? And do you have any other concerns we didn't touch on today? You know what would be awesome? If there was a video with everything we need to know about B12 in like under 10 minutes. Oh wait, we made one. Click right there. Let's end this madness of people on plant-based diets without B12. Spread the word. Peace.
We cannot do this diet because it is not safe. Not enough pasta. Come on, it's crazy. It's crazy.